I'm Rebecca Lowe from the IBA, and joining me in Yangon, Myanmar is the UK's ambassador to the country, Andrew Patrick. Andrew Patrick, thank you very much for joining us.
A pleasure to talk to you.
First, I'd like to ask you about the reform process in general. Could you just outline whether you feel it's still got momentum, that it's still pushing forward?
Well, there were some very, very significant reforms here instituted 2 years ago. In particular, the by-elections, the release of political prisoners and press freedom. And those were very significant. It's true that the reforms we've seen more recently have been less significant, and in some areas things have stalled or are potentially going backwards. But we're still seeing some economic reforms. For example, they've recently opened up the banking sector to international banks. That's a significant step forward.
Mm-hmm. Is there a concern that the reform may only be economic, that it may push forward in that department, but it leaves behind more kind of legal, fundamental, sort of democratic reforms?
I think there may be some people from the old days who think that the economic reform can replace political reform. I don't think that's the case. This country needs both fundamental political reform and fundamental economic reform.
There have been some concerns that the freedom of the press, which seemed to be making leaps forward, has actually retracted somewhat. We've seen some arrests of some prominent journalists recently. Is that a concern?
It is a concern. I mean, we're concerned about the arrest of the journalists, the prosecutions that we've seen, very heavy sentences handed down to some journalists, and that's very concerning. But on the other hand, you can still buy newspapers on the streets here perfectly freely, which print essentially what they want to print, and there hasn't been a return to censorship. So it's a mixed picture.
Mm-hmm. And what about the release of the 3,000 prisoners recently? I mean, how important was that?
Well, those were a mixture of normal prisoners and a very few political prisoners. There were only 2 or 3 political prisoners. Obviously, a large number of political prisoners were released last year, but what we've seen since then is a good number of demonstrators who've been prosecuted and put in prison. And so the number of political prisoners has actually probably risen since last December, and there needs to be a mechanism to address that.
Would you say the reform process has been as inclusive and transparent as you would like, and do you think that the whole country is invested in it?
No, of course. It's been remarkable considering the history of the country, but there's always more that could be done. There's a very lively debate in Parliament, and that institution has become a surprisingly, in some ways, representative institution in that there's genuine debate there. But of course there are many communities who feel that they don't have a voice, and indeed they don't have a voice here.
Just like to talk about the Constitution, because that is a key part of the legal reform process. A lot of people are pushing to reform it. There was a campaign recently with 5 million signatures on it. How important is it that the Constitution gets reformed?
Well, our view, and you would have heard our Prime Minister and others say this, is that you can't have a true transition to democracy unless you allow anyone who would like to stand, any citizen who would like to stand for the presidency. And of course that Dorsu is denied that opportunity at the moment. The role of the military is another important issue here. Now that takes time. We've seen in Indonesia it takes maybe a decade to sort of make that transition. But there needs to be a start to addressing that issue of the role of the military as well.
It sounds at the moment, though, like the government and the military are very disinclined to make those significant reforms. They came out with a report quite recently that basically said that they may make tweaks, but these fundamental reforms are probably not going to happen.
That's right. I think the report was disappointing. We'd hoped for more. I think the key focus now is on next year's elections, and those must be credible elections for this process to continue to be seen to be credible and to be sustained. So the focus is very much on those elections, and perhaps once those elections are finished we can return to the issue of the Constitution and so on.
And would you say those elections are free and fair and legitimate if the Constitution isn't reformed so Dorsu is able to stand?
Well, of course in one way they're not. If one of the most popular leaders in the country isn't able to stand for the most senior office, you can argue that the elections are not fair. But I think we're not going to dismiss them. We're working with the Election Commission, with the political parties, with civil society to try and make sure they are as credible as they can possibly be, and that the result reflects the will of the people here. And that would be an enormous step forward if that happens.
And what's the relationship like between the UK and Myanmar at the moment? Is it healthy?
Yes. I mean, obviously we have a long history here, and the most recent decades have been one where we've been seriously opposed to the government. That's not the position now. We are one of the most active countries in supporting the reform process here, and we have a lot of dealings with the government. So it is a healthy relationship now. There are things we're concerned about, of course, but there are other things where we're able to help the government take forward the reform process.
And what are those chief concerns?
Well, we've just talked about a few of them already. It's things like the issue of media freedom and political freedoms. We're still concerned about that. We're concerned about some rule of law issues, which I suspect we're going to talk a bit more about. And obviously we're concerned about the peace process, and we're concerned about the situation in Rakhine. So there are a number of things where we're critical friends of the government.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Rakhine situation, human rights issues in a moment. And just regarding the rule of law issues, there is a working group at the moment that's discussing a draft law to regulate the legal profession, and also a steering committee that's talking about a new national bar association.
Yes.
How important is it that those two projects press ahead and that we have a really independent, powerful judiciary at the end of this?
Of course, it's essential. A democracy has a number of pillars that it rests on. Freedom of the press is one of them, but a fully independent judiciary is another very important pillar of a true democracy. So it's very important. I think it's important for several practical reasons too. For me, the most important of those is that for most people in this country, they don't have any real access to justice. So there needs to be a judicial system that not only works for companies and for the elite, but also is able to provide justice and dispute resolution for the poorest in society. And then secondly, it's important because economies can't develop unless you have a clear and predictable legal system, and at the moment that doesn't really exist here. And finally, of course, there's a very long tradition that lawyers and bar associations play a very important role in taking forward human rights in a country and raising human rights issues and being a voice for change. And that happens a bit here, but I think once a full bar association is formed, that will be a very powerful voice in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned business interests there. I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Much of the international community has been very quick off the mark to congratulate Myanmar for its reform efforts, and a lot of businesses are chomping at the bit to get into the country. There are people such as Aung San Suu Kyi who have said that we need some caution here. What's your stance on that?
Well, we certainly need caution. And the companies who come here need to be very clear about how they're going to approach the market. There are very significant human rights issues about doing business here. That's why we're supporting the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business. One of their jobs is to advise companies on how they can best approach. I tend to think that having Western companies here is a good thing because they bring international standards, which haven't really existed. They bring skills transfer. And of course they're going to bring jobs and boost the economy, and I think everybody agrees that that's needed.
Is there a concern that some foreign investors might not have Myanmar's best interests at heart and may actually scupper the reform process rather than promote it?
Well, I think companies pursue their own interests. I think in general the British and international companies that we deal with see the reform process as very much in their interests. They need to see an open economy with an open judicial system, a democratic support for the government. All of those things are things that they want to see.
In June, the British Trade Minister Stephen Green visited Yangon and said that the UK recognised the attractiveness of the market, but that there were key hindrances to foreign investment, corruption, a lack of transparency, physical and technological infrastructure shortcomings, an underdeveloped banking sector. Are these being addressed, and how quickly are they being addressed?
Well, some of them are being addressed. Of course, his visit was in 2013, not this year, and some things have changed since then. I guess the most significant thing that's changed has been the decision to allow foreign banks to operate here. And we've just seen the end of that licensing round. So we will have foreign banks, and people will be able to transfer money in and out through foreign banks, and that will be important for investors. But things like the legal structure, still very important. They have signed the New York Convention on Arbitration, which is an important step forward, but there's a lot of work to do to make sure the judicial system here can actually implement the judgments under that convention.
And the British Chamber of Commerce has launched in Myanmar now, and how important is that?
It's very important for us, and I hope it's very important and useful for the companies who are part of it. And we've got over 100 companies who are part of it, so it's a very strong Chamber of Commerce, and I think it's a good basis on which to argue for change.
Do you think international institutions like the World Bank should put more pressure on kind of human rights reforms before they give international aid and international loans?
Well, there's always a debate in every developing country, and it's a particularly strong debate here given the history of this country. I think the two have to go hand in hand. You need to show some economic development in parallel with the reforms that address human rights concerns. And that's essentially what we've seen over the last year or two. There has been progress on human rights. It's not gone as far as we would like yet, but there's also been progress on the economy.
And some feel that maybe it's only the elites that are benefiting so far from the investment in the country. Is there any truth in that?
Of course. I mean, it is the case that economic growth tends to benefit the elite in the short term and hopefully benefits the whole country in the long term. One of the reasons we have a very large aid program here, it's over $100 million a year. The reason we have that is to try and make sure that economic growth, the benefits reach everybody, in particular the poorest people in society.
And now going back to talk about the human rights issues, you mentioned Rakhine State. I mean, that's a very sensitive, thorny political issue here at the moment. How are you going about addressing that, and what are the conversations you're having with the government at the moment?
Well, this is one of our top priorities, and I think it's a top priority for a number of countries here. I know that the US, we work very closely with on this issue. I visited Rakhine State 3 times now in the last year, and my colleagues are there at least once a month. So it's something we follow very closely, and we talk about to the government very often. We see the leaders of both communities there. It's a very difficult problem. It's difficult to see how you can resolve the fundamental political problem in the short term, but there's a good deal that can be done to improve the lives, particularly of those people who are in the camps, and secondly to ensure that there's no return to violence. And we are working with the government on those issues.
Because it seems it's not just a political issue though, is it? It also seems to be a social, cultural issue, that there is almost a discrimination against the Rohingya community and Muslim community. I mean, is that something that's also being addressed?
Well, that's the fundamental, one of the fundamental problems, and something we're very concerned about. There's a long history to the situation there, and one can't address it without having that history in mind. But you're absolutely right that the main victims of the conflict at the moment are the Rohingya community, particularly those people who are in camps, don't have access to livelihoods, have very poor access to healthcare and other services. And that's very concerning, and it's something that we've raised with the government repeatedly. Now the new Chief Minister has made some progress in getting services back to those communities, in particular health. A bit of progress is being made on that. There's a lot further to go, but the government has, I think, begun to address the issue. We're just at the start of I hope, a longer process.
And what are your thoughts about its proposals regarding the citizenship law?
Well, first of all, it's good that people who are entitled to citizenship are being offered citizenship, and that is a fundamental part of resolving the problem. We have some questions about the process. I think in particular the decision that people who apply have to identify as Bengali is problematic, because a lot of the community are reluctant to identify as Bengali, partly because they think that implies that they're foreigners in this country, and yet many of them, the vast majority in my view, have been here for many, many generations.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the ethnic conflicts as well elsewhere. We've seen these conflicts have been going on for many decades, and we've had peace deals in most of the states, but still the Kachin Independence Army is yet to sign a ceasefire. Are movements being made in that direction? Are you involved in those discussions?
We're very closely involved in supporting the process. It's a process between the government and the ethnic armed groups. It's not one in which the international community is mediating, but we are supporting it. There are some very thorny issues there, and as you say, it's a conflict with a very long history, so it's not surprising it's difficult to resolve it. But it's important, first of all, that they reach a ceasefire, but the fundamental issue is the future shape of the country, which will be decided in political talks. So it's what the country will look like, what the federal system will look like. Those are the really vital issues, and those will take some time to resolve.
And what about the issue of peace and justice, which is another very sensitive issue that the international community seems to be pushing very hard for accountability for past crimes committed by the regime, by the military. A lot of people inside the country, including Aung San Suu Kyi, seem to be pushing more for reconciliation. Some call it forgiveness. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I think I served in South Africa, which is obviously often held up as a model. And the South African process had many benefits, and there are some, I think, legitimate criticisms. Fundamentally, it's for the people of this country to decide how they want to address those issues. I'm convinced that they do need to be addressed, but exactly how you address them is for the people of this country. And so is the question of when they address them. So I don't think it's healthy for the international community to prescribe how those issues are dealt with.
Just a final question about the British government is offering military training to the Myanmar army.
Yes.
There's been a bit of controversy around that because it's said that the course may cover the art and science of war and border security management without enough mention of human rights provisions. Is that an issue?
Well, I think the word military training, I think, is misleading. This is classroom-based training on things like democratic control of the armed forces, how an army fits into a democratic system. It does cover human rights, covers international law. It's not about, how you fight a war. That's not the purpose at all. And I've found going around the country that the vast majority of people I speak to, including ethnic leaders, are very much in favour of it, because they see it as important to sort of expose the army here to international models, international best practice, broaden their horizon.
Fantastic. Ambassador Patrick, thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.